Sean Kidney here, CEO of the Climate Bonds Initiative. We're about to start a webinar, which will become a podcast around the European Union Taxonomy and Sustainable Finance. I'm incredibly lucky because with me today, I have two of my very, very good friends. And I'll tell you, after 18 months of intense discussion about taxonomy, we kind of become friends. Nathan Fabian from the UN Principles for Responsible Investment. In fact, the UN might be redundant now, but from the Principles for Responsible Investment, he's the Chief Responsible Investment Officer. And then Helena Viñes Fiestas from BNP Paribas Asset Management, who's been leading the work on usability and the practical application of the taxonomy for investors and for other parties. And we have some 1,000 people online listening to this. It's quite a community of interest around the taxonomy. Thank you for joining us today. This is an overview session. We're not necessarily going to get into the nitty-gritty details, but you're welcome to ask any question you like through the chat format. This is a teaser. We are going to be doing another 9 weeks, every week at this time, sessions of the taxonomy, with deeper dive looks at electricity generation, at transport. We'll be finishing up on a special session on usability only, and a session on the Green Bond Standard, where Ayla Aho, the rapporteur of the Green Bond Standard Working Group, will join me along with a couple of other people. So you're going to get a feast of information if you can tune in over the next 9 weeks, or you can subscribe to the podcast that'll be available on Spotify, Google, and Apple. Details all available at the Climate Bonds website. The European Union taxonomy is a fairly major development around the European Action Plan on Sustainable Finance. I'm going to ask Nathan to explain what the hell I mean by that in a minute and how it works. But just before we get going, we are clearly in the middle of a rather unusual crisis, with many countries around the world, including where I am in the UK, where Helena is in Paris, in lockdown. That is, we're not going out, and we have a significant contraction of GDP happening. Whether that's correlated with gross happiness indicators, everyone's at home at the moment with their families, that might actually improve, is a bit uncertain, but no doubt about it, it's a shock for the economy. We are learning the hard way about the need to ensure our societies and our economies and our health systems are resilient in the face of shocks. We have some challenges. We're in the middle of trying to sort them out around the world. We are going to have a century of shocks. The one thing that climate scientists have been telling us for 30 years now, without a doubt, is that increased temperatures on the planet will lead to volatility of weather, and a range of other indicators will lead to much crazier weather, storm surges, typhoons, 3 times as intense as we currently experience in East Asia, and so on. Our societies actually have to become more resilient. Otherwise, every time we're knocked over by an extreme weather event, whether that be fires in California or Australia, drought in South Africa, or floods in Germany, we will need to be able to recover. And there will be more pandemics. The World Health Organization and the IPCC's Health Committee have been warning about this for some time. Climate change and degradation of environments exacerbates the kind of viral vectors that lead to pandemics. I'm not saying this one is. You will see some chatter linking it to degradation of environment. That is just chatter. But we can expect more as we begin to experience the extremes of climate change, of all sorts of shocks. We've got to become more resilient. Health systems, protection systems, and in terms of weather volatility, our infrastructure. In the taxonomy, there's a big discussion about adaptation and resilience to get the ball rolling. Of course, we also need to stimulate our economies to get out of the recession that we're beginning to experience certainly in the Western world, and China's been through in the last couple of months. As we stimulate, as we drive the development of industry, the growth of demand, we need to have an eye on the future, not the past. We need to be looking towards what sort of world we know we have to build. We know we have to transform into low carbon, climate resilient, not the past world. We need green stimulus. The taxonomy is a procurement plan for the future. It's a framework for that stimulus. Now I'm going to ask Nathan to give us a little bit more about the background of the taxonomy, the key features, and why it's important in the context of the reforms underway in Europe. Dive in, Nathan.
Thank you, Sean. Hello to everyone. It is very good to talk to you. We hope you are as well as can be. So when we started the taxonomy work well over 2 years ago now, in the high-level expert group, in fact, the aim was to provide greater clarity to the market on how good was good enough when it came to the environmental performance of our investments and the companies that conduct economic activities every day. And so the idea of the taxonomy is a very simple one. It's a list of economic activities with environmental performance standards written for those activities. And so the idea itself is quite simple, and we believe a necessary part of our markets in future. If we're going to set environmental goals for the future, and clearly all governments are, all societies are, we're going to need to know what level of environmental performance in our economic activities is good enough to meet those criteria. And that's what the taxonomy helps us do. It's a sign of the future for the types of tools our markets will be having. Now, those that have followed this for some time will know that we had already released a list of criteria back in June of last year, and that just around about 3 weeks ago, we updated our recommendations, our criteria, and that followed feedback from the market. We had thousands of responses, in fact, technical responses on our criteria, and we tried to take those into account into our recommendations. And what you see on your screen at the moment are the outputs of that work in March. So we have a summary report which describes all of the changes we made since last June. There's a technical annex, the dreaded hundreds of pages, which has all of the criteria in there in detail. And we know that that just had to be written down properly. And that's what that is.
But Nathan, the actual thresholds aren't that long. It's rationale and explanation and so on and detail, right? But the thresholds themselves, that's not too bad.
No, that's exactly right, Sean. It is possible to have a one-line version of most of the thresholds and criteria. And so we have provided the spreadsheet as well, and that's a third item there, which does make it easier to use this tool. And so I think what you find, and what most people find, is when you have a bit of a look under the hood, you actually start to see that this idea is not too difficult in practice to understand the criteria and what's required. But very quickly, I'll just tell you what's changed since last June. So we've updated our 70 mitigation criteria. We've added adaptation criteria for 68 activities. And when we say, even though there's one set of qualitative criteria for all of those adaptation activities, we had to do the do no significant harm assessments. And that's why we're clear that that number of 68 is what we've been able to do so far. We've also provided extensive guidance for companies and financial participants on how to use the taxonomy. We've provided insights on what international harmonization of taxonomies can look like. And we have provided insights on what could be done to develop the taxonomy in future. And so that's why it's worth spending some time with the reports, and we'll cover as much as we can today. But if I can go to slide number 2, Sean, if that suits you.
Yes, let me see if I can figure out the technology. As you know, I'm a little challenged by this.
It's looking good. Okay, so this is an important slide because it helps people understand what type of activities are in this taxonomy. And clearly, if an activity performed by a company or an issuer is already zero carbon or negative emissions or very low, then clearly it should be in. doesn't need to be said. Nonetheless, it's important that it's captured in the tool, and we've done that. Where things start to become a little more interesting, and this is why we think of the taxonomy as a transition tool, a tool for economic transition on climate change, is that we have included activities that help other activities meet their targets, so-called enabling activities, and these are now represented specifically in the legislation or in the regulation that will form the basis of this. And so manufacture of components for renewable energy or manufacturing or transport, all of these activities can be in a clean and green taxonomy. The installation services, like those for buildings, putting new boilers or new insulation into buildings, these things also count, the services around this. And so this enabling category, Sean, really opens up, it expands our understanding of what should be part of a green taxonomy, which is fantastic.
Can I ask Helena a question? I mean, Helena, how important has been this work on transitions from an investor perspective to widen the universe you can invest in? Is this critical?
Yeah, it is critical. It's critical for two reasons, I would say. The first one is that traditional taxonomies that we use, most of us, most of investors, do not include transition activities. So we'll not go down into looking at sectors such as the manufacturing sector, industrial sectors, aluminium, cement. And two reasons why for that. One is because actually we don't know, what we should set the bar. And the second one is that we fear that we're going to be accused of greenwashing. So basically the taxonomy, by including transitioning activities, is expanding the investment universe of the classic, sustainable investments. And I would say another thing, it is the taxonomy, as Nathan was saying, it is a great tool for plan and report on the transition, not only for companies, but equally for investors.
Cool. Thank you. Sorry, Nathan. Go ahead. I just wanted to get an investor perspective.
No, of course. And Helena's right. And I think there's been discussion throughout this process about whether or not the taxonomy is good for transition. And so it's important to note that the regulation specifically identifies activities that contribute to transition. And so this is part of the framework. And so whether it's Mark Carney or people in the green bond market or whoever who are most concerned about providing incentives and encouragement to people to invest in the transition, we believe there's many features in the taxonomy which actually achieve that. And we'd encourage people to look very closely at it. And so that's why we provided criteria that allow for some emissions. You don't have to be zero emissions today in order to be consistent with the transition pathway. But you still have to have very, very low emissions. And we try to recognize that if these assets are going to have an operating life throughout the next 30 years towards our net zero by 2050 goal in Europe. And that might bring us on to the next slide, Sean, after which I'll pause. We've got to remember transition. The idea of transition is it's a trip to a destination. And we know what the destination is in Europe. It's net zero by 2050, and it's going to have a very steep 2030 and 2040 stop off along that journey to 2050. And so when we're setting our thresholds, we've got to think about the end point. We've got to think about the operating life of assets through this 30-year period. And that's why these thresholds look tighter than some people would have expected. And just to make sure people are clear, where we would have in the past, including in TCFD, for example, thought about financial risk and how our assets are placed today and how we can incrementally improve our asset performance, reduce emissions by 10% from where they are today, reduce them by a little more, and thereby extend the economic life of the asset. Well, the truth is sometimes those reductions are not going to be good enough to be called sustainable. And this is where the taxonomy is different. The things about the destination, the operating life of assets, and it sets criteria and thresholds that can support the assets being called green through as much of the life of the asset as possible. And so just have a look at that curve. That's a steep curve. And if we don't get our assets down and our industries down at that level, then we're relying massively on negative technologies, which are very difficult to deploy in that short time period, even though, of course, we will have some. So, Sean, why don't I pause there?
But just picking up that point, that is the key issue, right? We still have to create a future we can live in and have these assets. If we don't do that, nothing works. So, and the European target now is 50% reduction by 2030 in emissions that we're working to, which is a tough target. But I think it's important to note for our listeners, this is not the TEG's view. This is the IPCC 1.5 degree view. This is the view of our climate scientists. This is in fact, the International Energy Agency's view when they've done their sub 2 degree modelling for how we achieve it. We're simply channeling the scientists. And the truth is, the last 30 years, we haven't been listening to our scientists. They keep saying, it's terrible. And we keep saying, yeah, we'll get to it. We'll do a little bit now. We'll try and improve our buildings. But now we're in a pickle because despite 30 years of chat, emissions kept going up until last year where they flatlined for the first time in God knows how long. And as a result, the emissions reductions we have to achieve are commensurately much, much tougher and steeper to make up for 30 years of talking but not actually delivering globally at least. Shared responsibility, let's be clear. So that's the pickle we've found ourselves in, and that's affected a number of the specific thresholds that we've put out in the taxonomy, which I want to dive to next, except I just had a question from someone. And online, please do use the chat function to ask questions. People are raising their hands. I'm not going to be able to go with you on audio because at the moment we have 740 people listening in. So it'll be challenging. So you need to type your questions and we'll do it. Does this mean we don't need transition bonds? Now, I realize this is not taxonomy, but hey, what do you reckon?
Yeah, well, Helena will have a view, but I think there is there's clearly a role for financing that helps assets transition. If you want to call them transition bonds and build a market understanding about the attributes of those bonds, absolutely fine. The thing that the taxonomy gives us is a benchmark by which to compare the environmental performance of those transition bonds. And this is the role of the taxonomy. So we have a common baseline and we can say, okay, I've got a transition bond. It allows an asset to make an improvement from very high emissions today to a much lower level for the next 5 or 10 or 15 years. But ultimately, this asset is never going to reach the green taxonomy thresholds. Okay, now I understand what type of transition we're talking about. We're transitioning away from a very high emissions footprint to a low emissions footprint, but the asset is going to be inconsistent with the targets over the long term. So absolutely develop that market, but the role of the taxonomy is for that comparator, and that's what we really need.
Yeah, and to add to that, that's absolutely right, because from an investor perspective, what it helps you, the taxonomy, is to distinguish exactly and allow you to make informed decisions where you put your money. Do you want to put your money in a product, in a bond that is only it's only going to achieve momentarily gains, but it's not going to make that asset, green or meet the 2050 goals? Or do you rather put your money in another bond that is going to allow the transition and reach that? And I think that is what the taxonomy does, is that it provides clarity to the market so we can make informed investment decisions.
Fantastic.
Sean, can I just quickly add one point? I mean, we've got to remember that reducing emissions from high emissions footprint assets today is really a valuable thing to do. We just got to understand that that doesn't mean that assets should have an indefinite operating life at a marginally better performance level, because that's where we're going to keep tripping outside the budget. And so this idea of transition, it's got to be calibrated to something, and that's what the taxonomy is for.
So we've got to have a destination for our transition. It can't be a transition to nowhere or to a halfway house.
Yeah.
Okay, and for those of you interested, the Climate Bonds Initiative will be publishing a white paper on this topic in about 6 weeks, fleshing out the agenda as outlined in the Technical Expert Group's report, with more ideas for people for how to take this forward. I happen to think there's a lot of benefit in the transitions argument we've included in the taxonomy to focus people's minds on what we've got to do. It's not about only doing stuff which is 2050 perfect. It's about shifting everything. Our economies have been built on fossil fuels. It's given us wealth. It's given us medicine, thank God, which gives us a better chance of surviving the virus. But it's come at a great cost. And now we've got to switch. That's what it means. And unfortunately, we've got to switch in double time. So let's have a look at how this plays out in the specific criteria, thresholds that we've published for inclusion. You've got a bunch of pictures in here. Now, this is a one-page summary of a 700-page report. So clearly there's a lot of detail in the explanations and the do no significant harm features. When we developed these criteria, we talked about substantial contribution, which is linked to climate change, adaptation, mitigation. We talked about not doing any harm, significant harm, to the other environmental issues that were given us as a brief by the Commission. They're not unrelated, by the way. Pollution control is one of those, and biodiversity. Well, we know that improving pollution gives our ecosystems a better chance to bounce back and to retain biodiversity. We know that biodiversity is a predictor of ecosystem resilience in the face of climate shocks. So they're all interlinked, but there'll be more work on those other criteria going forward. And the do no significant harm at this stage ensures, you know, if you build a solar farm, you don't build it on a wetland. Now, it might be common sense to you and I, but it isn't necessarily always followed. You can't build a low carbon railway line to a coal plant because you're going to increase emissions. So that kind of collateral damage issue is what's exemplified in the do no significant harm measures. Now, I'm going to tackle a couple of these and Nathan's going to tackle a couple, and we'll field questions about them. But let me start with the electricity group, which in some ways is the most, the sharpest discovery of this process. By looking at the IPCC report and looking at the International Energy Report, and in fact, there's a story that a press release put out by Fatih Birol, the executive director of the International Energy Agency at the 2018 World Energy Outlook. It says, essentially, to meet the Paris Agreement sub-2 degree target, there can be no new unabated fossil fuels. Any fossil fuels that we're building now, which are not involving carbon capture and sequestration, are contributing emissions that we simply cannot do if we're going to achieve 50% cuts in 10 years. That's the gist of it. This is challenging, right? In 2015, we were all told that unabated gas was a transition fuel. Many of us planned our climate change strategies at a national level on that basis. But again, the science has changed as a result of the impact of not doing enough and just talking for 30 years and not listening to our scientists. Now our scientists come back to us and says, guys, it was a great idea, but that window is closed. To achieve the transition, we need to capture the emissions of fossil fuel and bury them or use them in some way, or else simply not do it or whatever. So the threshold for sustainable investments in line with the Paris Agreement is a pretty tough 100 grams of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour. Solar and wind are in. We've done the assessments, we've looked at the assessments, I should say, and decided we're not going to ask anyone to do individual plant assessments. The science is pretty clear. With geothermal, we will ask people to do an assessment, a life cycle assessment. Some geothermal can leak a lot of, or rather, interacting with calcium under the ground, can generate greenhouse gases at a reasonably high level. So we've got to weed those ones out. Hydro, there are simple tools provided. Hydrogen, we're saying green hydrogen and blue hydrogen. It's still got to be underneath the 100 grams threshold in a life cycle analysis, is in. In fact, it's really important for us to achieve our objectives in other sectors like manufacturing and the steel industry, that we grow dramatically the availability of green hydrogen and blue hydrogen, gas with carbon capture and sequestration, generating that, to be able to make the transition in industrial sectors. So there's a lot there. With storage, we're saying any kind of electricity or energy storage is basically in, unless you're using fossil fuels. Problemo. Grids, transmission. Hey, we've got to electrify our world. That gas cooker in your house, it's got to go. It's got to become an electric induction. That means that we need to shift to the kind of grid and transmission system that can support an extension of usage of electricity to our cars, to more mass transit, and can better balance across Europe, particularly for renewable energy. How do we make sure that North Sea wind generation, which is growing fantastically fast thanks to the various countries around the North Sea, can be spread around Europe so it can be used in Poland and Switzerland as well? That's grids. So we have a very generous approach to grids, which I'm going to say has shocked some of our grid companies, but it's about understanding what the future looks like. We do exclude a grid line generated that goes to a coal plant or fossil fuel plant for the same reason as that railway line. You get the idea. There's a lot of detail in here. Carbon capture and sequestration, investments in their own right that can be used by multiple applications are in. There are some thresholds, some rules. We do require careful analysis of leakage factors, etc. So there's a bit of detail in there. In the buildings area, we've got 3 measures for you. It's like a smorgasbord. You can choose. 1 for renovations, 1 for new buildings, and 1 for the ownership or the acquisition of existing buildings. Now, if you're a bank and you've got a portfolio of loans for mortgages, it's likely to be in the latter. Not necessarily, but likely to be. That is, you're lending to people to buy a house that exists already. Or if you're a real estate investment trust. So for the ownership and acquisition threshold, we've said you've got to be in the top 15% of energy performers in your market, in your country. We have not specified specific proxies to use. In our draft report in June, we talked about energy performance certificates. It's proven to be problematic for us to take the step of making specifications. We've asked the Commission to look further at this. In the meantime, we're saying to investors, to green bond issuers, to banks, find a way to show, to give us a strong evidence-based argument that the portfolio of buildings you're looking at or the individual buildings meet that threshold of top 15% of the market. And there are many tools around to do this, by the way. There's no shortage. And that's it. That threshold, the intent is to decline, to reduce to 2050. We want all buildings to be called sustainable in 2050, be zero net carbon. In 5 years, that'll toughen. Between now and 2025, we'll be introducing absolute energy and possibly emission thresholds. And then that figure will then tighten down to 2050. That's how we'll make it work for the industry. In new build, well, you know, we're lucky in Europe that the Commission has pushed through near zero energy building standards that are quite ambitious. Now, there's different applications in different countries, but generally, this is a fantastic initiative. By the end of this year, all public sector buildings in Europe that are new, that are built, are going to have to meet this tougher standard in every single country. By the end of next year, all commercial buildings and so on. So, new build, at minimum, of course, will have to meet those regulations, but we want a bit of extra. An extra 20% on top of the NZEB in the first year, for example. That will get tougher. We actually want new build. We're saying to be sustainable, we expect new build to be net zero carbon by 2030. So if you create a building then and you want to call it sustainable or loan to it, that's what you're going to have to look for. Renovations. If you're doing the renovations to a shopping centre or a large development or even a house, you can count the cost of the renovation. If you achieve a 30% improvement in energy efficiency, and we're looking at the emissions question for future, but it's 30%, it's not 5%. You need to study. Now, it is possible in the future, we need to look at separate standards for laboratory buildings or certain kinds of shopping centres or whatever. But that's not what we've published at this stage. That's something that the Sustainable Platform, which will be continuing the work on the taxonomy, will have the potential to examine. And if you're a bank or real estate trust, make submissions to the Commission accordingly. Am I okay, Nathan?
No, that's a fantastic review. Would you like me to add to it?
Yes, please. Go ahead.
Okay, so I'll just quickly touch on some of the sectors that Sean didn't mention. So in transport, many of the criteria relate to vehicles, obviously, but some of them relate to transport infrastructure. And we've recognized that the infrastructure investment opportunities around transport are enormous. We have rail to build, we have electric networks, charging networks to build. These are all enormous opportunities, and we want to encourage and signal to the market the importance of these. As Sean said, we've got to electrify everything. Interestingly, in transport, we have mainly focused for the vehicles on the tailpipe performance. Now, we all recognize that the amount of emissions embodied in the vehicles must also be considered one day. We just didn't have the data to make it work at this stage. But we recognize that in future, we will bring some of these embodied emissions in. And it's the same idea in buildings, actually. We set out that the embodied emissions are going to have to be considered. And if I can on buildings, just add, that's why we've got a below NZEB or below net zero performance for new buildings. It's one of the reasons, because of the embodied emissions. But so this idea of looking upstream, showing up, add on buildings in a sec, I'll just say this idea of looking upstream at the whole life cycle of emissions is something we tried to build in, and we've always been clear where we could do that, but where we'll have to do it in future.
But it's important to note that people worry, is an electric car in Poland a good idea? Look, actually, the data's showing it's still lower emissions than petrol anyway, just not hugely in a very high carbon electricity grid. But it is the right kit for the future. We will convert the electricity system of Poland to green. It's part of European targets, and we need to make sure we're building the right infrastructure for next year and 10 years down the track. So we need more electric charging stations, not more petrol stations, to take that forward. And that's part of the theme of the future will be electric.
Yeah, exactly right. So if we look at some of the other sectors too, you'll note that some of the sectors have qualitative criteria, and the land use sector is a good example of that. And that's because in this huge sector, both for crops and livestock, the practices vary so much across Europe and in fact, obviously around the world. So we've focused these criteria on identifying the good ways to manage, reduce and store carbon in the physical land assets, if you like, and the way we manage waste. And so again, it's almost like a smorgasbord. There are things you can choose to do to improve the performance of the assets that allow this to be applied very flexibly. And we know that agriculture has not always been easy, for example, for institutional investors to reach out and find through their traditional asset classes. But hopefully this is one factor that can start to make these types of assets more attractive. Now in manufacturing, go ahead, Sean, you're going to jump in with a question?
No, finish manufacturing, please. Go first.
Yeah, so in manufacturing, we've really relied on the EU ETS benchmarks quite widely. And the reason we've got manufacturing is because we wanted to ensure, again, that we were going to the part of the economy where big savings in emissions could be made. For anyone who's interested in transition, I encourage, start with the manufacturing sector. We know the investments required are enormous in this sector to maintain output at a very high or a very good emissions performance. But this is the industrial economy that with the jobs, with the economic productivity, with the output. And so if we're talking about green stimulus, Sean,
Yep.
you can do no better as a government than directing these industrial sectors to apply the stimulus to upgrade facilities to meet these thresholds.
Exactly right.
The jobs can be maintained, the companies can be kept whole, the shareholders can be kept whole, the money can flow through to where we need the investment to go. And that's no better example than in the manufacturing criteria that we've got here. Just so very quickly, in addition, we've got criteria in waste, we've got criteria in the water, infrastructure sector, and of course we've got forestry. And I hope our forestry industry people on the call are satisfied with where we got to. That was a long and difficult technical process to make sure we caught all the nuances of forestry in different parts of Europe, but hopefully we've now got a very well functioning set of forestry criteria that are built on the industry frameworks that people have. If I can just make one final summing up point in a way, Sean, about all these criteria. One of our guiding principles as the TEG was to try and use frameworks and systems that made sense in industry already today. And so that is why we've got some different measurement frameworks and different rules and ideas in different sectors, because they respond to the ways that different industries are used to reporting and used to measuring their environmental performance. And so in the buildings area, we're working towards a framework for energy performance certificates. In forestry, we're relying on FSC and forestry practices that have been used to try and make these frameworks workable as much as possible. And that's why you get some slight variation. That's a trade-off decision, but hopefully we've made it easier, especially for companies who have to report. But that's the reason why investors will see some difference across those sectors, but we think it still makes sense. Anyway, I'll leave it there for the moment.
No, that's good. I want to just add something about the manufacturing side, because we've been guided by the ETS, but we do not expect these to be end targets for those industrial sectors. They're transition. You know, and we've had the fantastic news early this year with SSAB in Scandinavia saying that by 2026, they're going to be offering zero net carbon steel in the European market. Like, whoa, like who would have thought the steel industry can make that transition? And thank you, by the way, to the Swedish government for announcing at the Paris Climate Change Agreement they were going to work with SSAB on this. Now, we've seen since then a leading Chinese steel company say they're looking to do the same by 2030. China produces most of the world's steel. This is critically important, and so on. So it's beginning to happen. We think we're going to be able to tighten those criteria fairly quickly. We will be reviewing, not necessarily changing, but reviewing thresholds every 5 years on when it comes down to manufacturing, to building, to energy, to see whether we can tighten further yet. In the meantime, one of the jobs for the Commission, for European countries, in fact for all of us in this area, is to look at how we can further accelerate this transition. How can we work with the finance sector, with the steel industry, to ensure that the hydrogen needed, which is one big chunk of what they need to go to zero net carbon, is generated at a price point that is viable. This is doable with large-scale hydrogen generation from the North Sea wind, from Saudi Arabia, Australian solar, and so on. And you will see this year much more work along those lines. In the cement industry, worth, by the way, 7% of global emissions, right? This is crazy, the cement we're using. We've seen products actually on offer already, which are 70 to 80% lower emissions than the cement that's used by most people. They're slightly higher price because they're a niche product at the moment. You scale them up, the price drops. Wow. Can we figure out how to get the price equal quickly with some strong state action? Maybe the European countries acting together to be able to ensure some adequate. These are the sort of discussions that will get us this threshold. So these thresholds are tough, but they're not that tough. They're eminently achievable, we will argue. We want to see, and we're saying to the Commission as a separate part of our discussions, now let's get together all the key actors to achieve this change. Let's get Helena with BNP Paribas Asset Management. Let's get the iron and steel industry of Europe and Japan, for that matter, in a room and nut out a transition pathway, because our scientists are telling us there's no choice. We have to get those emissions down. It's not actually a good to have anymore. It's now becoming an absolute necessity to avoid a catastrophic future. Moving on. Before I let you go, Nation, because I want to get Helena to talk about it, we're getting a lot of questions online, by the way, and I'll feed a few to you in a minute. Social. There's been a lot of talk about should the taxonomies take social.
Yeah.
What's your thoughts? It's not part of our brief at this stage. Looking forward.
Helena might have a view to share, but I think it's already a social taxonomy. If you look at the strength of the UN guiding principles for businesses on human rights, and that they flow through, and the way that it picks up the OECD guidelines, this is now an extremely robust set of social requirements. So it wasn't our mandate to design, but the social protections are extremely strong. So I think we're well on the way. the idea of positive contribution criteria over and above these standards, well, that's something the whole community is working on, and we've still got a way to go, but I think we can do very well with what we've got there now.
Yeah. I would like to add 2 points. So I totally agree. I think that the inclusion of the OECD multinational guidelines, which, by the way, they look farther than just human rights, labor rights, and bribery and corruption. They also look at things like taxation, competition, consumer protection. So they're extraordinarily comprehensive. Also, in the taxonomy regulation, they added the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, which are very thorough when it comes to human rights. But the other point I wanted to make is that everyone needs to understand that taxonomy operates at activity level, not at company level. And one thing is to look at the activity and how that activity needs to perform. And another thing is to look at how the activity is conducted. So the OECD multinational guidelines look at how the activity is conducted. Now, if we were to create a social taxonomy, looking at social activities, then we enter a much more complex world. Because let's think about education, yeah? What are the investments today on education, particularly in the stock market? Because let's not forget that the taxonomy is primarily a tool for investors. Well, the majority might be, universities, elite universities in the US and China, and nothing against those. But when we think about our contribution to the Sustainable Development Goal of education and access, universal access to education for everyone, it might not be the best way. So I think that we need to think about how exactly that social taxonomy should look like, whether and what type of methodology, and for what type of investment universes.
Fantastic, thank you. We're getting questions piling in at a pace. Thank you, everyone. We're not going to be able to cover all of them, but we will attempt to pick up many in email afterwards. And I remind you, we've got another 9 of these coming up every week from now on, different sectors. So if you want detailed and more on usability in May from Helena and some of her colleagues, keep dialing in. There's a question that's come up about the target. Did we set our target? The IPC is actually saying we need to do better than 0 by 2050. I just want to say we have adopted at this stage the European Union target as our framing for this. From an individual, I'm going to say we will need to do better, in my view. In the 2030s, Europe will need to lead the way. The developed countries need to lead the way. But it's not the case now. This is strictly based on the recommendations we've had from scientists, and this will do us for 10 years. If we can deliver on this, 50% cut in 10 years in Europe, we can support the rest of the world showing how to do it. So that's the theory of change behind it. We've had questions about all sorts of stuff, but just for you, Helena, who's actually going to be affected first? And tell us a bit about the compulsory versus the non-compulsory aspect. I mean, does everyone have to worry? Do I have to worry at home?
Well, you might be able to contribute as a citizen, and we'll get to that point. So companies and investors are the primarily, the 2 actors that are primarily affected, yeah, and in a different manner. But what they both share is that maybe they're going to face some short-term pains for long-term gains. So, but let's start with the companies. So for the companies, basically the taxonomy means that they're going to have to do a thorough checkup. Like when you go to the doctor, yeah, and you'll have your taxonomy, okay, and we'll have to look and check all the installations at asset level, how the different activities are being conducted. And they're going to measure them, benchmark them against the taxonomy. As you very well said, actually the substantial contribution, the technical criteria is not that long. It might be one-liner, so it's not that cumbersome. At the same time, they're not only going to look at the performance of the activity per se, but equally about how it is being conducted so that it doesn't harm the other environmental objectives. So they need to check. Basically, the taxonomy is like a tool, an environmental risk management tool that tells you exactly what you need to comply with, what you need to look at. Yes. Now, the interesting thing is that the companies will have to report on how, to what extent they're using the taxonomy, how the taxonomy, relates to their activities, and then the percentage of the turnover and CapEx, and if relevant, OpEx, that actually is associated, is aligned with the taxonomy. So it's mainly a reporting obligation, right? Well, it is only a reporting obligation, but in order to do a reporting, you need to do the checkup.
So if you're a company and you're a conglomerate, let's say, you've got multiple business lines in multiple industries, you just figure out what you've got and report on that part of it? Is it as simple as that?
No, it's slightly more complicated, because I think that one of the characteristics of the taxonomy is that the taxonomy actually works bottom up. That means that you need to look at the different installations. So imagine it's a cement company, just to make, as you mentioned before, yeah? And you have 3 plants, just to make it easier. You need to look at the performance of each one of the plants, and then imagine of the 3 plants, only 1 actually meets the taxonomy, then only the revenues generated from that plant can be accounted. So it's bottom up. And we investors and companies are used to look at the average of the performance of one activity, which is one of the complexities that we find. But at the same time, the taxonomy is actually going to allow us, for instance, investors, to really have a clear picture, a map of the companies, and see which sites, which operations are not in line, and which ones they are. So actually the level of the conversation between investor and companies, it's going to be much, much more granular. Yes, I can see that you put the example of the utility.
I put it up for you, yes.
Yes, you
go
put
ahead.
it on but before we go there, I wanted to follow in on the example, for instance, of the cement company. Yeah, you do your check up, you have it. Now the interesting thing is that to what extent that checkup, against the taxonomy is actually going to influence your investment decisions, your strategic decisions as a company. And I'll tell you what, I think there are going to be quite a lot of incentives to respond to that, not least because investors, on the other hand, are actually going to be using exactly the same tool. And they're going to be using exactly the same taxonomy and the lenses, not only to assess companies, but also to construct the portfolios, because now they know exactly, what is sustainable, what is not sustainable. But and I think this is the critical point. The taxonomy is first and foremost for investors a common measurement tool. Let me explain. What the regulation obliges investors is to explain to what extent and how have they used the taxonomy for those funds that either have an environmental objective or environmental characteristics. In fact, the taxonomy obligation, the disclosure obligation, is for all products. It's just that those that do not have environmental characteristics or objectives can actually use a disclaimer. Anyway, the bottom line is that all investors will be using exactly the same metrics, the same definitions, the taxonomy, to measure how sustainable the funds are. And they will have to report the percentage of that fund that is aligned with the taxonomy. So I will have 2 funds, and I will have one maybe it's 10%, the other one 60%. And that needs to be disclosed, which basically means that down the investment line, the retail investor, but also all clients, will be able to choose between 2, 3, or 4 funds. And they will have that common measurement or indicator. Now, what is important, if I may, is that when looking at the impact of the taxonomy, you cannot just think of the taxonomy itself. The taxonomy is the cornerstone of the Easy Action Plan, but it's only one piece of the puzzle. Yeah. If we go back to what I was explaining, you have, different funds, and you have the percentage of alignment to the taxonomy for each one. So 10, 50, 60, whatever it might be. Yeah. Now, by the time the taxonomy comes into force, it will be also obliged in Europe, because of the amendment to MiFID, to ask all clients for their ESG preferences when you give investment advice. So I will be asking you, if you come to BNP Paribas, Sean, you know, whether or not, you know, what are your ESG preferences? And of course, I hope that you say, I actually really care for the environment, the transition. I want to contribute to that. And I will say, okay, now here you have different funds that have an environmental objective. Which one will you choose? And if I can even go further, because and let me give you an analogy. When I go to the supermarket, I don't know about you guys, but my knowledge about chemistry is actually close to zero. Yeah, but I actually buy detergent that has the eco label, right? Why? Because what I know is I have no idea what is within the product. All I know is that it doesn't harm the environment, that it's positive for the environment. Well, we will have an eco label and we will have green labels across Europe that by law will have to refer based on the taxonomy. And this is a critical point because we are for the very first time opening the door to the citizen to make a decision, a conscious decision, whether or not they want to contribute to the transition, they want to contribute to the ecological transition, and make a decision about their finances.
And who's not going to want to? Well, a lot of us will.
Exactly.
A question to Nathan, Principles for Responsible Investment. You represent, I've lost count of the tens of trillions that you represent now. How's the reaction that you're seeing amongst your broader members? You've got BNP Paribas Asset Management, I know, has been very supportive. Is this likely to be picked up by the European investment industry quickly, even before it becomes mandatory at the end of 2022?
Yes, it's already being picked up. We have started a working group of signatories, and we have 50 medium to large asset managers, some owners in Europe, working in weekly taxonomy implementation plan. 50 substantial funds managers.
Did you say weekly?
Immediately. It might be every 2 weeks, regularly, and several times, and they're starting to see a case on future implementation, which we will be promoting publicly.
Fantastic. So we already have engagement around this. Folks, we're coming to the end of our time. We've got about 6 minutes left. Nathan, I've got like 100 questions queued. Many of those questions are relevant to specific areas of the taxonomy: electricity, waste management, etc. Tune in to the relevant weekly webinar about it, and that's where we'll try and address the questions. We won't do it now. This is a more overview thing. Helena, is to leave in people with an idea, the practical advice you would offer. You know, you've talked about what companies need to do or how investors will do it. What would you give us, say, 3 key bits of practical advice for people around the implementation of the taxonomy? Tips.
Okay, the first one is obviously to read our summary report. In the summary report, we actually go through the different steps that investors need to undertake in order to assess the percentage of alignment of a particular company. But let me take one step back for a minute. On the final political agreement of the taxonomy regulations, they included compulsory reporting for companies, for all companies in Europe that fall under the scope of the non-financial reporting directive. This is great news for investors from a practical point of view, because that means that if your investment universe is MSCI Europe, for instance, all you will have to do is to take the percentage of turnover of each one of those companies that they will give to you, and then weight it, you know, depending on the weight in your portfolio, then you will calculate the percentage of your portfolio that is aligned with the taxonomy. Crystal clear, much easier than before, you know, straightforward. And for equities, we think it's better to use turnover, but of course you can use capex, because some investors might decide, I'm actually want my fund to be forward-looking, and I'm going to invest in those companies, for instance, that at least 20% of the capex is invested in the transition, right? In taxonomy-aligned activities. Now, that is the exercise is not so simple when actually you have companies that fall out of the scope of the non-financial reporting directive. And this is where the guidance that we provide in the summary report comes, into play. It's really important. The slides that you are showing, it's an example that we have in the report as well of, how will you judge or assess for a company. It's 5 steps, and I don't know if I have enough time right now to go through them, but what I would say is that follow those 5 steps and do not get overwhelmed, because we know very well, because we did quite a lot of tests, even with our own funds, that is not crystal clear. And this is why we also recommend investors that when they cannot assess 100%, the alignment, they can also disclose the percentage of the fund that is potentially aligned, because it seems that, that X percentage of that company is aligned with the taxonomy, but they haven't been able to prove or to, a do not significant harm criteria, for example. But it has to be clear that when it comes to the quantitative criteria, that you need to check, that you need to verify. It becomes more, more difficult to assess when it's qualitative criteria. And many people have asked us about that. And this is why we recommend to conduct thorough due diligence, and we explain in the report how that works.
Thank you. This podcast will become available if you want to listen to Helena's words of wisdom again. Nathan, we are doing in Europe a brown taxonomy as a result of the Parliament Member State Commission agreement in December, right? Going forward. Am I right in understanding that?
Yeah, so there's a agreement to conduct a study, but we do see very strong political momentum behind this idea. Once you have a taxonomy that has brown criteria and green criteria, you end up with 3 categories. There are many in the market who would like to see this functional approach to implementing this. So we know what green is, we know what significantly harmful and too brown is, and then we create a space where companies can be moving in their performance. So I think there's a lot of momentum behind this. It's a study first, but we do expect it to follow.
Fantastic. And if you were going to give advice to the people you've been speaking to, especially PRI members, but also members of the financial and corporate and industrial sector in Europe, what's it going to be?
So the first thing is to realize that this is the beginning of the new era on sustainable investment, where we move from thinking about our processes and our governance to looking at the actual sustainability performance of the underlying investments and companies and the issuers. This is a trend which is inescapable, and it's because the goals are now becoming clearer. So spend the time, get used to understanding environmental performance thresholds and the actual performance of companies. And we give this message to PRI signatories more and more, and we expect it to be central to the idea of responsible investment in future.
That's a pretty powerful message. Folks, we're at the end of our hour. As I said, we've got lots and lots of questions. What's this going to mean? Final comment for Nathan and Helena, because I've been asked a lot. We're in the middle of a virus scare. I've made a few comments up front. Is this going to stall, or is this going to be turbocharged by the recession we're currently beginning to experience? This is not a formal taxonomy question, folks. Any thoughts on your thinking about this?
Well, I would say that we are at risk of missing the opportunity that will come in a recovery phase. We should not underestimate how much direct pressure, signalling, asks we need to make to our policymakers so they understand the importance of this. We have a window to do that. We need to grab it. If we're propping up and retooling our industry with the same level of emissions performance they had yesterday, and it takes us 10 years to come out of this crisis, we have got a massive problem on environmental and social sustainability. So this is a critical moment and we must not waste it.
Yes. I would add to that that if we are serious about the transition and we want to avoid the catastrophic consequences that are also economic, then we need a common framework and we need a common goal. And this is what the taxonomy does. It is a common tool that we can all use to plan and report and finance the transition. But I want to leave with a positive note. I actually think that the taxonomy equals great business opportunities not only for investors to invest in green financial products, and not only for companies that provides them an opportunity to access better and more finance, but for other actors that they are not today, they don't fall under the taxonomy regulations, such as banks, because the amount of opportunities in the debt side is incredible, in the commercial banking side, from mortgages, green leases, it's enormous. And the taxonomy is just, the very beginning. The taxonomy sets the foundations, but the incentives are going to come next. And that's when this story becomes really big.
Beautiful. Thank you, Helena. Thank you, Nathan, for joining me today this afternoon in the middle of this crisis we're experiencing in Europe, and for your hopeful remarks about how we might be able to do something in the face of this crisis and make this taxonomy a framework for a new Europe and really a new world. Folks, we've got a big job. Get out of this recovery, get out of this crisis. That's going to be challenging enough, and still make sure that in 10 years, emissions are reduced 50% and we've become climate resilient for the shocks that are already in the system we're not going to be able to escape. But this is it, a procurement plan for the future. We have it here. Thank you for joining us. This will be available, as I said before. You'll be able to download it, instructions on the Climate Bonds website. And now watch out for the next 9 weeks of events, which will do deep dives into different areas and so on. We'll get Helena and probably Nathan back again in future weeks, along with many other people, and we'll try and answer some of the very detailed questions that you provide today. They aren't lost. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us, and good luck making our world, we're all in this, sustainable. Thank you.
And safer.